There's something about fishing that just clears your head, you know? For Jack Mitchell, those Saturday mornings at the community pond were the best part of his week. He wasn't some professional fisherman or anything like that. He just enjoyed the quiet, the fresh air, and the chance to unplug from everything for a few hours. Jack had moved into Riverside Estates 3 years ago. It was one of those planned communities with neat rows of houses, perfectly trimmed lawns, and strict rules about everything from mailbox colors to where you could park your car. But there was one thing that made it all worth it: the pond. Right at the edge of the neighborhood, surrounded by tall grass and a few willow trees, it was the only spot in the whole subdivision that felt natural and peaceful. The Homeowners Association rules actually encouraged residents to use the pond. The handbook they'd given him when he moved in specifically said fishing was allowed as long as you followed catch and release. Jack always did. He wasn't keeping any fish anyway. He just liked the process, casting the line, waiting, feeling that little tug when something bit. Most of the time he didn't even catch anything, and that was fine by him. Every Saturday, like clockwork, Jack would wake up around 6 in the morning. He'd make himself a quick cup of coffee, grab his tackle box and fishing rod from the garage, and walk the 5 minutes to the pond. By the time he got there, the sun would just be starting to peek over the horizon, and the whole place would be covered in this peaceful morning mist. He'd usually have the place to himself for an hour or two. Sometimes old Mr. Peterson would come by with his dog for a morning walk. Sometimes the Johnson family would bring their kids to feed the ducks, but mostly it was just Jack in the water. He'd found his favorite spot, a little clearing near the biggest willow tree where the fish seemed to gather. He'd set up his folding chair, get his line ready, and just exist for a while. It wasn't just about the fishing, really. It was about having a space where nobody expected anything from him. No work emails, no phone calls, no honey-do lists. Just him and nature doing their thing. In a world that never seemed to slow down, those Saturday mornings kept him sane. So when Patricia Whitmore showed up that particular Saturday morning, Jack knew something was off. Patricia was the president of the Homeowners Association, and she wasn't exactly known for casual morning walks by the pond. She was more the type to drive around the neighborhood looking for violations. Grass a little too long, Christmas lights still up in January, that sort of thing. Jack noticed her standing on the walking path about 30 feet away. She wasn't alone either. 2 other people were with her, both wearing serious expressions and clipboard-carrying postures that screamed official business. They stood there, watching him for a good 5 minutes before Patricia finally started walking toward him. "Good morning." "Patricia," Jack called out, trying to sound friendly even though his gut was telling him this wasn't a social visit. "Mr. Mitchell," Patricia said, her tone as cold as the morning air. She didn't waste time with small talk. "I need to speak with you about your activities here at the pond." Jack reeled in his line and set his rod down carefully. "My activities? You mean fishing? I'm following all the rules if that's what you're worried about. Catch and release, just like the handbook says." Patricia pulled out a sheet of paper from the folder she was carrying. "Several neighbors have filed complaints about your presence here. The board has reviewed the matter, and we've determined that your fishing activities are in violation of community standards." Jack felt his stomach drop. "Violations? What violations? I've been fishing here every Saturday for 3 years. Nobody's ever said anything before." "Well, things have changed," Patricia replied, handing him the paper. "This is a formal notice of violation. You're required to cease all fishing activities at the pond effective immediately." Jack took the letter and skimmed through it. The language was formal and intimidating, full of phrases like repeated infractions and failure to comply with community aesthetics. But nowhere did it actually say what rule he was breaking. "I don't understand," Jack said, looking up from the letter. "What specific rule am I breaking? The handbook says residents can fish here." Patricia's expression didn't change. "The board has determined that your activities are not in keeping with the peaceful enjoyment of the common areas by other residents. That's all you need to know. But who complained? Can I talk to them? Maybe there's been a misunderstanding." "The identities of complainants are kept confidential," Patricia cut him off. "This is the board's decision, Mr. Mitchell. I suggest you accept it and move on." The 2 board members behind her nodded in agreement, like backup singers confirming every word their lead singer said. Jack felt heat rising in his face. He'd been nothing but a good neighbor. He kept his lawn perfect, paid his HOA dues on time, never caused any trouble. And now they were telling him he couldn't fish in the community pond, something that was explicitly allowed in the rules? With all due respect, Patricia, this doesn't make sense. Show me where in the bylaws it says I can't fish here. I've read that handbook cover to cover. There's nothing in there that... The board has broad discretion in interpreting community standards, Patricia interrupted again. We don't need to justify every decision to individual homeowners. Consider yourself notified, Mr. Mitchell. And just like that, she turned and walked away. The other two board members followed her like obedient ducklings, leaving Jack standing there with his fishing rod and a piece of paper that essentially told him his Saturday morning piece was over. Jack stood there for a long moment, staring at the letter. Around him, the pond continued its morning routine, birds chirping, water lapping gently against the shore, fish occasionally breaking the surface. Everything was exactly as it had been 10 minutes ago, but somehow everything had changed. He looked down at his fishing rod, then at the water. Part of him wanted to just pack up and leave, avoid the conflict entirely. That's what most people did with HOA disputes, right? Just go along to get along. Life was too short to fight over something like fishing, but another part of him, a bigger part, was angry. He wasn't doing anything wrong. He'd followed every rule, been a model resident, and now they were coming after him for something that was explicitly allowed. It didn't add up. Jack slowly gathered his gear, folding up his chair and securing his tackle box. As he walked back toward his house, he couldn't shake the feeling that something bigger was going on here. Patricia's attitude, the formal letter, the mysterious complaints from neighbors he'd never had problems with, it all felt orchestrated somehow. By the time he got home, his wife Linda was up and making breakfast. She took one look at his face and knew something was wrong. "What happened?" she asked. Jack tossed the letter on the kitchen counter. "Apparently I'm a criminal now. The HOA says I can't fish at the pond anymore." Linda picked up the letter and read it, her eyebrows rising higher with each sentence. "This is ridiculous. You're not breaking any rules." "I know," Jack said, pouring himself another cup of coffee. "But Patricia made it pretty clear they don't care. The board has decided, end of story. So what are you going to do?" Jack leaned against the counter, thinking. He could just accept it. Find some other way to spend his Saturday mornings. Maybe drive to a different lake somewhere outside the community. It would be easier than fighting the HOA. But the more he thought about it, the more wrong it felt. He'd done nothing to deserve this. And if they could come after him for following the rules, they could come after anyone for anything. "I don't know yet," Jack finally said, "but something's not right about this whole thing, and I'm going to find out what it is." Jack decided to skip fishing the next Saturday, not because he agreed with Patricia's ridiculous letter, but because he wanted to do some research first. He spent the week digging through his HOA documents, reading every single line of the bylaws and covenants. Nowhere did it say fishing was restricted. Nowhere did it mention community aesthetics as a reason to ban legal activities. If anything, the documents encouraged residents to enjoy the common areas. He even found the original developer's brochure from when the community was built. It had pictures of families fishing at the pond, kids playing by the water, couples having picnics. The whole selling point of Riverside Estates was the natural pond area. And now they were telling him he couldn't use it? On Tuesday evening, Jack sat down and wrote a formal response to the HOA. He kept it polite but firm, citing the specific sections of the bylaws that allowed fishing. He requested copies of any neighbor complaints and asked for clarification on which rule he was supposedly breaking. He even included photos showing how he always cleaned up after himself and followed proper catch and release techniques. He hand-delivered the letter to Patricia's house on Wednesday morning. She answered the door in her bathrobe, clearly annoyed at the early interruption. "I thought I made our position clear," she said, barely glancing at his letter. "You did," Jack replied calmly, "but your position doesn't match the actual rules. I'd appreciate it if you could present this to the board and provide me with the documentation I requested." Patricia took the letter with obvious reluctance. "The board meets next Monday. You'll hear from us." That was Thursday. By Saturday, Jack received a second letter. This one was even more aggressive than the first. It claimed he had been fishing during non-permitted hours and that his equipment was creating visual blight in the common area. Jack had to read it twice to make sure he wasn't imagining things. Non-permitted hours? His tackle box was visual blight? This was getting absurd. But what really made his blood boil was the fine at the bottom of the letter. $50 for the first violation, the violation he supposedly committed 3 weeks ago, even though he'd only just been told about it. Linda was furious when she saw it. They can't just make up rules and fine you for breaking them retroactively. That's not how this works. Apparently it is how it works, Jack said, tossing the letter on the kitchen table, at least in Patricia's world. Are you going to pay it? Jack thought about it. $50 wasn't going to break the bank. But it wasn't about the money. It was about the principle. If he paid this fine, he'd be admitting he did something wrong when he absolutely did not. No, he said. I'm not paying it. Let's see what they do next. What they did next came faster than he expected. The following Tuesday, another letter arrived. This one fined him $100 for a second violation. Apparently for fishing last Saturday, except Jack hadn't fished last Saturday. He'd stayed home specifically to avoid conflict while he worked on his response. He immediately called the HOA management company that handled the paperwork. The woman on the phone was sympathetic but ultimately useless. I'm just processing what the board sends me, sir. If you want to dispute the fine, you'll need to request a hearing with the board. Fine, Jack said. I'm requesting a hearing. I'll add you to the agenda for next month's meeting. Next month? This is urgent. They're fining me for things I didn't even do. I'm sorry, sir. The meeting schedule is set. The next available date is October 15th. Jack hung up, feeling more frustrated than ever. A month away? They could send him a dozen more bogus letters by then, rack up thousands in fines, and he'd have no way to defend himself until October 15th. He decided to take a different approach. If the HOA wouldn't listen to him, maybe his neighbors would. Jack spent the next few evenings walking around the neighborhood, knocking on doors, asking if anyone had complained about his fishing. He talked to the Robertsons, who lived nearest to the pond. He talked to the Tanaka family, who walked their dogs past there every morning. He talked to everyone within 3 blocks of the pond. Nobody had complained. In fact, most people had no idea there was any issue at all. Mrs. Robertson even said she enjoyed seeing Jack there on Saturday mornings. It made the pond feel more lived in and friendly. You should talk to Kevin Chen, old Mr. Peterson suggested during one of these conversations. He used to kayak on that pond every Sunday until about 2 months ago. Stopped suddenly. Never said why. That was interesting. Jack had noticed the kayaker before. A younger guy who seemed to really enjoy paddling around in the early morning. But now that Mr. Peterson mentioned it, Jack couldn't remember seeing him recently. He looked up Kevin Chen in the neighborhood directory and gave him a call that evening. Oh man, Kevin said when Jack explained the situation. Yeah, I got hit with the same thing. 3 letters in 2 weeks, then they started fining me. Said my kayak was blocking the path, which was total garbage because I always kept it off to the side. They claimed multiple people complained, but nobody ever said anything to my face. Did you fight it? Jack asked. There was a long pause. No, I couldn't afford to, honestly. Between the fines and the threat of putting a lien on my house, I gave up. Figured it wasn't worth the stress. I really miss it, though. That was my therapy time, you know? Jack knew exactly what he meant. So you just stopped using the pond? Yeah. Haven't been back in 3 months. After hanging up with Kevin, Jack felt a knot forming in his stomach. This wasn't just about him. They'd done this before. They had a pattern of pushing people away from the pond, and they were willing to use bogus fines and intimidation to do it. But why? What was the point? The next letter arrived on Friday. $200 this time for a 3rd violation. The letter was increasingly hostile in tone, warning him that continued non-compliance will result in legal action, including potential liens against your property. A lien? Overfishing? Jack couldn't believe what he was reading. Linda found him at the kitchen table that night, surrounded by all the letters and his HOA documents, trying to make sense of it all. This has gotten out of control, she said quietly. Maybe we should just pay the fines and be done with it. I don't want them putting a lien on our house. It's not right, Jack said, but even he could hear the exhaustion in his voice. We didn't do anything wrong. I know. But is it worth this much stress? You've barely slept all week. You're obsessing over this. Jack rubbed his eyes. She wasn't wrong. He had been losing sleep. He'd been so focused on proving he was right that he hadn't stopped to consider whether winning this fight was actually worth the cost. Around the neighborhood, Jack started noticing changes. Some neighbors who used to wave at him now avoided eye contact. One guy who usually stopped to chat hurried past with a quick nod. Word was spreading and apparently not in Jack's favor. He overheard a conversation at the mailboxes one afternoon. Two women he didn't know well were talking in hushed tones. "I heard he's been defying the HOA for weeks now," one said. Patricia said he's being completely unreasonable. "Some people just can't follow simple rules," the other replied. Jack wanted to say something, to defend himself, but he kept walking. What was the point? Patricia was controlling the narrative, and he was becoming the neighborhood troublemaker in everyone's eyes. The following Monday, a certified letter arrived. Jack signed for it with a sense of dread. Inside was a notice that the HOA board was considering placing a lien on his property for continued and willful violation of community standards and failure to pay assessed fines. The total they claimed he owed, $350 plus $50 in administrative fees, $400 for fishing in a pond where fishing was explicitly allowed. Jack sat on his front porch that evening, watching the sun set over the neighborhood. He could see the pond from here, just barely visible through the trees. It looked so peaceful from a distance. He thought about Kevin Chen giving up his Sunday kayaking. He thought about how the HOA was making him feel like a criminal for something that should have been completely normal and acceptable. That's when something clicked in his mind. This wasn't about fishing. It couldn't be. The reaction was too extreme, too coordinated, too aggressive for something so minor. Patricia and her board were pushing people away from that pond for a reason. Jack needed to find out what that reason was. He stood up and walked back inside. Linda was in the living room reading. "I need to file a records request with the HOA," he said. "They have to provide board meeting minutes to homeowners, right?" Linda looked up from her book. "I think so, yeah, why?" "Because something bigger is going on here, and I'm going to find out what it is." For the first time in 2 weeks, Jack felt like he had a purpose beyond just defending himself. He wasn't going to just fight the fines anymore. He was going to find out the truth. Jack spent most of Tuesday morning crafting his records request. He'd looked up his state's HOA laws online and found out that homeowners had the right to inspect board meeting minutes, financial records, and certain correspondence. The HOA had to provide these within 10 business days of a written request. He kept the letter professional and specific. He requested all board meeting minutes from the past 6 months, any documentation related to pond usage policies, and copies of any complaints filed about his fishing activities or Kevin's kayaking. He emailed it to the management company and sent a physical copy certified mail to Patricia's address. The response came faster than expected. 3 days later, Patricia herself called him. "Mr. Mitchell, I've received your records request. I have to say this seems like an overreach. You're wasting board resources on a trivial matter." "It's not trivial to me," Jack replied calmly. "I'm being fined $400 for something I didn't do wrong. I think I have a right to see the complaints against me. The board operates in the best interest of all residents. We don't have time to entertain every individual grievance. Then you won't have any problem providing the records I'm legally entitled to see." There was a long silence on the other end. "Fine, I'll have them sent to you. But I'm warning you, Mr. Mitchell, continuing down this path isn't going to win you any friends in this community." Was that a threat? Jack couldn't quite tell, but it certainly felt like one. The documents arrived 8 days later, right at the deadline. Jack came home from work to find a thick manila envelope on his doorstep. He didn't even take off his shoes before ripping it open at the kitchen table. Linda came in from the backyard and saw the papers spread everywhere. "Is that them?" "Yeah," Jack said, already scanning through the first few pages. "Let me see what we've got here." The meeting minutes were typed up formally with dates, attendance records, and summaries of discussions. Jack started with the most recent one and worked backward. For the first 3 meetings, there was nothing about the pond at all. Just regular HOA. Business, landscaping contracts, speed bump proposals, holiday decoration guidelines. Then he got to the meeting from 4 months ago. Right there in black and white. Discussion of pond area redevelopment proposal presented by Trevor Whitmore. Jack stopped. Whitmore, same last name as Patricia. He kept reading. Trevor Whitmore had presented a plan to enhance community amenities by redeveloping the pond area into a members-only clubhouse and pool facility. The estimated cost would be covered by a special assessment of $5,000 per household. $5,000 per household. That would be over $1 million total for the community. Jack's hands were shaking as he flipped to the next meeting's minutes. The board had voted to explore the feasibility of Trevor's proposal. Patricia had abstained from the vote, but the minutes noted that Trevor Whitmore was her son-in-law. Son-in-law. Patricia's daughter's husband was trying to sell the HOA on $1 million development project, and Patricia was the board president who could make it happen. "Linda, you need to see this," Jack called out. His wife came over and read over his shoulder. "Oh my God, this is a total conflict of interest." "It gets better," Jack said, flipping through more pages, or worse, depending on how you look at it. The next meeting minutes showed the board discussing challenges to the redevelopment plan. One of the challenges listed, "Current resident usage of pond area may complicate transition and create opposition to proposal." Jack felt his stomach turn. They weren't trying to stop him from fishing because of complaints or rules. They were trying to stop him from fishing because him using the pond made their development project harder to push through. He kept digging through the documents. There was no record of any neighbor complaints about his fishing. None, not a single one. The complaints Patricia had cited in her letters simply didn't exist. But there was something else. In the meeting from 3 months ago, right around when Kevin must have gotten his first letter, the minutes noted, "Board discussed strategies to reduce pond usage to facilitate future redevelopment. Motion approved to increase enforcement of community standards in pond area." "They targeted Kevin first," Jack said, showing Linda the entry. "He told me he got harassed until he gave up. I bet there were others too." Linda sat down heavily in a chair. "This is crazy. They can't just bully people to make room for a development project." "Apparently they can," Jack said. "And they're doing it." He gathered up all the relevant pages and started making copies. This was bigger than just fishing rights now. This was about corruption, conflicts of interest, and an HOA board that was willing to lie to homeowners to push through a project that would cost everyone thousands of dollars. But Jack needed more information. He pulled out his laptop and started searching for Trevor Whitmore. It didn't take long to find him. Trevor ran a residential development company called Whitmore Properties LLC. His website showed off several previous projects, fancy clubhouses, pool facilities, and community centers. All with hefty price tags. Jack dug deeper. He found Trevor's business registration with the state and cross-referenced it with the dates in the meeting minutes. Trevor had formed Whitmore Properties just 8 months ago. This pond project would be his first major contract, so Patricia's son-in-law had a brand new development company and needed a big project to get established. And Patricia just happened to be the president of an HOA with a pond that could be redeveloped. How convenient. Jack spent the entire evening connecting the dots. He made a timeline showing when Trevor presented his proposal, when the board approved exploring feasibility, and when the harassment against pond users began. The pattern was unmistakable. The next morning, Jack called Kevin Chen again. "Hey, I found something. Can you meet me for coffee?" They met at a cafe outside the neighborhood. Jack spread out copies of the meeting minutes on the table between them. Kevin's eyes went wide as he read through them. "I knew something was off, but this is actual fraud." "Not quite fraud," Jack said, "but definitely unethical, and possibly illegal depending on how deep this goes. What are you going to do?" "I'm going to the next board meeting, and I'm going to expose all of this in front of everyone." Kevin looked nervous. "Are you sure that's a good idea? Patricia's not going to just roll over. She'll fight back." "Let her fight," Jack said. "I've got documentation. I've got proof." What she got? A bunch of made-up complaints and a conflict of interest she never disclosed? The next board meeting was scheduled for the following Tuesday. Jack spent the weekend preparing. He made copies of all the relevant documents. He highlighted the key sections. He even practiced what he was going to say, making sure he could explain everything clearly and calmly. Linda was worried. What if this backfires? What if people side with Patricia? Then at least I'll know I tried, Jack said. But I don't think they will. Once people understand what's really going on, that they're being manipulated so Patricia's son-in-law can make money, I think they'll be pretty angry. Tuesday evening came. The board meeting was held in the community center, a small building near the pond. Usually these meetings only drew a handful of residents, Mostly the same retired folks who came to every meeting out of boredom or civic duty. But Jack had spent the past few days spreading the word. He'd knocked on doors, sent emails, made phone calls. He'd told people that something important was going to be discussed and they should come if they cared about the future of their community. He'd been deliberately vague about the details but urgent enough that people paid attention. When Jack walked into the community center at 7 o'clock, he was stunned. The room was packed. At least 40 people had shown up, maybe more. Chairs were filled and people were standing along the walls. Patricia looked shocked too. She sat at the board table up front with 3 other board members, and Jack could see the confusion on her face as she scanned the crowd. "Well," Patricia said, calling the meeting to order, "we have quite a turnout tonight. Let's go ahead and start with point of order," Jack said, standing up. "I have evidence of board misconduct that I'd like to present during the open forum period." Patricia's face went white, then red. "The open forum is at the end of the meeting, Mr. Mitchell. You'll have to wait." "That's fine," Jack said, sitting back down. "I can wait," but Patricia couldn't seem to focus after that. She rushed through the regular agenda items: approval of last month's minutes, treasurer's report, landscaping update, speaking too fast and stumbling over her words. The other board members kept glancing at Jack nervously. Finally, they reached the open forum. "Mr. Mitchell," Patricia said tightly, "you have 3 minutes." Jack stood up and walked to the front of the room. He had a folder full of documents and a knot of nervous energy in his stomach. This was it. 3 months ago, Jack began, the board started harassing residents who used the pond. They sent threatening letters. They issued fines for made-up violations. They claimed neighbors were complaining when no complaints existed. I know because I was one of those residents. And I was confused why they'd target someone for fishing in a pond where fishing is allowed. He paused, looking around the room. Everyone was listening. Then I requested board meeting minutes. And I found out the truth. Jack held up the documents. Patricia's son-in-law, Trevor Whitmore, wants to redevelop our pond into a private clubhouse. A project that would cost every household here $5,000 in special assessments. And the board has been systematically driving residents away from the pond to make it easier to push this project through. The room erupted in shocked voices. Patricia shot to her feet so fast her chair nearly tipped over. "That's enough. You're out of order, Mr. Mitchell. This is a private board matter and you have no right to—" "Private?" Jack interrupted, his voice carrying across the room. "You're planning to charge every family here $5,000 and you think that's private? These are public records, Patricia. Everything I'm saying comes directly from the meeting minutes that you signed." He held up the papers for everyone to see. "There's more. The board voted to reduce pond usage to make the development easier to sell to residents. That's why they came after me. That's why they went after Kevin Chin and his kayak. And I'm betting there are others here who got harassed too." A woman near the back raised her hand tentatively. "They sent me letters about my bird watching. Said I was disturbing the wildlife. I thought it was strange, but I didn't want to cause trouble, so I just stopped going." "Same here," an older man added. "They told me my grandkids were too loud when we fed the ducks. We've been doing it for 2 years with no problems, then suddenly we're getting violation notices." More voices joined in. Jack watched as the pieces fell into place for everyone in the room. They hadn't made the connection before, but now it was obvious. The board had been systematically clearing the pond of users. Patricia's face had gone from red to almost purple. "This is a mischaracterization of board discussions. Trevor's proposal was simply one idea among many. We were exploring options to enhance our community amenities. By lying to residents?" Jack cut in. "You told me there were neighbor complaints. You put it in writing, but there are no complaints in the records. You made them up. The board has discretion in how we handle complaints." "Show me one complaint." "Just one." Jack looked around at the crowd. "Has anyone here complained about my fishing? About Kevin's kayaking? About Mrs. Henderson watching birds?" Silence. Then heads started shaking. No one had complained. "You can't show me a complaint because none exist," Jack continued. "You fabricated violations to drive people away from the pond because your son-in-law needs this development project to succeed." One of the other board members, a man named Richard Lopez, was looking through his own copy of the minutes with a troubled expression. "Patricia, did you disclose your relationship to Trevor when he presented this proposal?" Patricia hesitated just a second too long. My relationship isn't relevant to the board's fiduciary duties. Actually, it's extremely relevant, Jack said. He pulled out another document. I did some research. In our state, HOA board members are required to disclose any conflicts of interest. Having your son-in-law pitch $1 million project to the board you control is pretty much the textbook definition of conflict of interest. Richard Lopez stood up. Patricia, I'm on this board and this is the first I'm hearing that Trevor Whitmore is your son-in-law. You never mentioned that. I abstained from the vote. Abstaining isn't the same as disclosure, Richard shot back. He looked genuinely angry now. You should have told us. We have a right to know when there's a personal connection to a business proposal. Jack could see the mood in the room shifting. People were angry, muttering to each other, shaking their heads. Patricia was losing control of the situation fast. But here's the thing that really makes this whole situation unbelievable, Jack said, pulling out the final piece of evidence he'd been saving. I did a title search on the pond property. You know, just to understand who actually owns it and what the development restrictions might be. He held up a printout from the county records office. The pond and the 50 feet around it aren't actually HOA property to redevelop. When Riverside Estates was originally developed, the builder put the pond area under a conservation easement. It's protected wetland. No building is allowed ever. The room went completely silent. Even Patricia seemed stunned. That means, Jack continued, even if the board approved this project, even if every homeowner voted yes and paid their $5,000, the development couldn't legally happen. The county would never issue the permits. Trevor's proposal was dead in the water from day one. Richard Lopez was staring at Patricia now. Did you know about the easement? Patricia opened her mouth, closed it, then opened it again. Trevor said he could work around it. He had lawyers looking into— So you did know, Richard said. You knew this project was probably illegal, and you pushed forward anyway. You harassed residents, issued bogus fines, and tried to manipulate this community for a project that couldn't even be built. The other two board members were looking at Patricia with identical expressions of shock and betrayal. One of them, a younger woman named Beth Carter, stood up and moved away from the board table entirely, as if she didn't want to be associated with Patricia anymore. This is unacceptable, Beth said to the room. I had no idea any of this was happening. If I'd known about the conflict of interest, about the fabricated violations, I never would have supported exploring this proposal. None of us would have, Richard added. Patricia was scrambling now. You're all overreacting. This was just preliminary planning. Nothing was set in stone. We were simply trying to improve our community. By lying to us? Someone shouted from the crowd. By fining people for doing nothing wrong? Another voice added. How much was Trevor paying you? Kevin Chen called out. He'd been sitting quietly in the back, but now stood up. Because someone had to benefit from this. You weren't pushing this hard just out of family loyalty. Patricia's eyes widened. How dare you suggest— I did some digging too, Kevin said, walking forward with his phone in hand. Trevor's company paid consulting fees to someone named P. Whitmore. $5,000 over the past 3 months. Want to explain what services you were consulting on, Patricia? The room erupted again. People were standing now, shouting questions, demanding answers. Patricia looked around wildly, like a cornered animal. This meeting is adjourned, she tried to say, but her voice was drowned out by the noise. No, it's not, Richard Lopez said firmly. I'm calling for an emergency vote. I move that we hold a special election for new board members immediately. I second that, Beth Carter said without hesitation. You can't do that, Patricia protested. The bylaws require 30 days' notice for— The bylaws also prohibit fraud and conflicts of interest, Richard interrupted. You've violated your fiduciary duty to this community, Patricia. It's time for you to step down. The crowd was clearly on Richard's side. People were nodding, clapping, voicing their agreement. Jack pulled out one more document. I've already drafted a petition calling for a special election. It needs 20% of homeowners to sign. I think we've got way more than that in this room tonight. He started passing the petition around. People practically fought to sign it. Within minutes, it had more than enough signatures. Patricia stood there, watching her authority crumble. You're making a huge mistake, she said. But even she didn't sound convinced anymore. Trevor's project could have been great for property values. Trevor's project was illegal, Richard said flatly. And even if it wasn't, you went about this in the worst possible way. You lied to residents, You abused your authority. You took money from your son-in-law while pushing his proposal through board meetings. The state HOA regulatory board is going to want to hear about this, Beth added. She was already typing on her phone. Conflicts of interest, undisclosed payments, fraudulent violations. That's serious stuff. Patricia finally seemed to realize how much trouble she was in. Her face drained of color. I was just trying to do what was best for the community. No, Jack said quietly. You were trying to do what was best for Trevor. And for yourself. The community was just a means to an end. Linda had been sitting in the back, but now she came forward and put a hand on Jack's shoulder. He realized he was shaking slightly, adrenaline from the confrontation. Richard Lopez took control of the meeting. Okay, everyone. Here's what's going to happen. We're going to accept this petition for a special election. That election will take place in 3 weeks per emergency bylaws. In the meantime, I'm recommending that Patricia step down as president immediately to avoid further conflict. I will not, Patricia started. The alternative is that we report everything to the state board right now and let them investigate, Richard said coldly, including those consulting fees. Your choice. Patricia grabbed her papers, stuffed them into her bag, and walked out of the meeting without another word. A few people actually clapped as she left. The room slowly settled down after that. Richard and Beth stayed to answer questions and start organizing the special election. People crowded around Jack, thanking him, apologizing for believing Patricia's version of events, sharing their own stories of HOA overreach. Kevin Chen shook Jack's hand. Man, I wish I'd done this when they came after me. Thank you for not giving up. Thank you for helping, Jack replied. That consulting fee information was the perfect final nail in the coffin. As the crowd thinned out, Richard Lopez came over to Jack. I owe you an apology. I should have been paying closer attention to what Patricia was doing. That's my job as a board member. You didn't know, Jack said. I should have known. That's the problem. Richard looked tired. I'm not running for re-election. I think we need fresh blood on this board. People who will actually watch out for stuff like this. Jack nodded. He understood. Sometimes the cover-up was worse than the crime, and not speaking up when you should have could haunt you. As he and Linda walked home that night, past the pond that had started all of this, Jack felt a weight lifting off his shoulders. It wasn't over yet. There was still the election, still the state investigation, still the fines to be reversed. But the truth was out now. The community knew what had happened. And most importantly, nobody was going to take away his Saturday morning fishing spot. The next 3 weeks moved faster than Jack expected. The day after the explosive board meeting, Richard Lopez and Beth Carter called an emergency session to deal with the immediate fallout. Their first order of business was officially voiding all the bogus fines that Patricia had issued. Jack got a formal letter in the mail 2 days later. It was short and to the point. All violations against him were being removed from his record, all fines were canceled, and the board offered a written apology for the harassment he'd endured. Kevin Chen got the same letter. So did Mrs. Henderson and the grandfather who'd been told his grandkids were too loud. It felt good to be vindicated, but Jack knew the real work was just beginning. The special election was set for 3 weeks out, just like Richard had promised. Nominations were open to anyone in the community, and for the first time in years, people actually seemed to care about who was running. Usually HOA elections were formalities. The same handful of people ran unopposed year after year. But this time was different. Jack got asked at least a dozen times if he'd consider running for president. He appreciated the confidence, but he knew that wasn't his strength. He was good at finding problems and fighting when necessary. But running an organization? That took a different skill set. Instead, he threw his support behind a woman named Diane Foster. She'd lived in Riverside Estates for 7 years, worked in nonprofit management, and had a reputation for being fair and organized. More importantly, she'd been at that board meeting and had immediately understood the gravity of what Patricia had done. If I get elected, Diane told Jack over coffee one morning, my first priority is transparency. No more closed-door decisions. No more conflicts of interest flying under the radar. Everything gets documented. Everything gets disclosed. That's exactly what we need, Jack agreed. The campaign period was refreshingly drama-free. People put up simple signs in their yards, sent out email introductions, and actually talked about real issues like road maintenance and landscaping contracts instead of just making promises about community enhancement. It felt like how local elections should work. Patricia didn't go quietly, though. She sent out a mass email to the entire neighborhood claiming she was the victim of a politically motivated witch hunt and that Jack had misrepresented the facts at the meeting. A few people who hadn't been there might have believed her, but most residents had either attended in person or heard the full story from neighbors who had. The email actually backfired. It reminded everyone why they wanted new leadership in the first place. Trevor Whitmore's development company website quietly disappeared from the internet about a week after the meeting. Kevin Chen, who'd been keeping tabs on the situation, noticed it first. When he tried to look up Whitmore Properties LLC with the state business registry, he found that Trevor had filed dissolution paperwork. The company was shutting down. Guess his first big project being exposed as illegal fraud wasn't great for business, Kevin joked, though there was real satisfaction in his voice. The state HOA regulatory board did launch an investigation, just like Beth Carter had promised. An investigator showed up to interview Richard, Beth, and several residents, including Jack. He was professional and thorough, asking detailed questions about the timeline, the consulting fees, and Patricia's conduct as board president. "I can't tell you what action we'll take," the investigator said at the end of Jack's interview, "but I can tell you this kind of thing is taken seriously. Board members have a legal obligation to act in the community's best interest, not their own." Jack didn't need to know the specifics. He trusted that Patricia would face consequences one way or another. Election day arrived on a Saturday morning, fitting since Saturdays had started this whole mess. The community center was set up as a polling location and the turnout was incredible. Usually HOA elections got maybe 20% participation. This time it looked like nearly 70% of homeowners showed up to vote. Jack and Linda walked down together to cast their ballots. As they approached, Jack noticed something that made him smile. The pond was visible from the community center parking lot, and there were at least 6 people there. Someone was fishing. A couple was walking their dog. A family was feeding the ducks. The pond was being used again just like it was meant to be. The results were announced that evening. Diane Foster won the presidency with almost 80% of the vote. 3 new board members were elected too. People who'd never been involved in HOA politics before but wanted to make sure nothing like Patricia's scheme ever happened again. Richard Lopez and Beth Carter both chose not to run for re-election, which Jack respected. They'd done the right thing in the end, but they wanted fresh faces leading the charge. Diane's first board meeting as president was nothing like the ones Patricia had run. She opened with a commitment to transparency and invited residents to attend and participate. Nearly 30 people showed up, which had to be some kind of record for a regular monthly meeting. One of the first items on the agenda was officially rejecting Trevor Whitmore's pond development proposal. The vote was unanimous and several people in the audience clapped. Then Diane brought up something Jack hadn't expected. "I've heard from several residents that our pond area could use some improvements. Not development, just maintenance and amenities. I'd like to form a volunteer committee to make recommendations." Mrs. Henderson raised her hand. "What kind of improvements are we talking about?" "Nothing major," Diane said. "Maybe some benches so people can sit and enjoy the view. Maybe a small dock for the kayakers. Better paths around the perimeter. Simple stuff that makes the pond more accessible and enjoyable for everyone." Jack liked the sound of that. "I'd be happy to serve on that committee." "Consider yourself appointed," Diane said with a smile. Over the next few months, the committee met regularly. They kept everything low-key and inexpensive. No million-dollar clubhouses or special assessments. They installed 3 wooden benches overlooking the water. They built a small dock that Kevin Chen and other kayakers could use for easy access. They created a better walking path with wood chips and added a few bird feeders near the edge of the pond for Mrs. Henderson and other bird watchers. The whole project cost less than $3,000, funded from the HOA's existing reserves. No special assessments needed. The day they finished installing the last bench, Jack stood back and looked at the pond with genuine satisfaction. It wasn't fancy, but it was exactly what the community needed. A simple, peaceful place where people could relax and enjoy nature. That Saturday morning, Jack was back at his usual spot with his fishing rod. But he wasn't alone anymore. Kevin Chen was out on his kayak, paddling slowly across the water. Mrs. Henderson was on one of the new benches with her binoculars, watching a blue heron in the reeds. A young couple Jack didn't know well had brought their toddler to see the ducks. The pond had become popular again. Word had spread that it was safe to use it without fear of bogus violation notices. People were rediscovering what had attracted them to Riverside Estates in the first place, that beautiful natural pond that made the neighborhood feel less like a cookie-cutter subdivision and more like a real community. Linda came down around 8 with a thermos of coffee and sat in one of the new benches near where Jack was fishing. "Catch anything?" she asked. "Not yet," Jack said, "but that's not really the point." "I know." She poured herself a cup of coffee and looked out over the water. "I'm proud of you, you know, for not giving up." Jack reeled in his line and cast it out again, watching the morning sunlight dance on the water. "I almost did give up, remember? You asked me if it was worth the stress, but you didn't. And now look at this place." She was right. The pond was alive with activity, and the whole community felt different somehow. More connected. People actually talked to each other now, stopped to chat on the walking paths, organized little gatherings by the water. Fighting Patricia's corruption had brought neighbors together in a way that years of HOA potlucks and holiday parties never had. A few weeks later, Jack ran into Richard Lopez at the grocery store. The former board member looked healthier than he had in months, less stressed. "How's retirement from the HOA treating you?" Jack asked. Richard laughed. "Best decision I ever made. Diane's doing great, way better than I ever did. You know what the difference is? She actually pays attention. She asks questions. She doesn't just go along with whatever sounds good in the moment." "That's what we needed," Jack agreed. "It's what every HOA needs," Richard said. "But most people don't realize there's a problem until it's too late. You did everyone a favor by speaking up." As for Patricia, Jack heard through the neighborhood grapevine that she and her husband were planning to move. Whether that was because of embarrassment, the state investigation, or just wanting a fresh start somewhere else, he didn't know. Honestly, he didn't care much either. She'd face whatever consequences came her way, and that was enough for him. The state investigation did conclude eventually. Patricia received a formal reprimand and was banned from serving on any HOA board in the state for 5 years. It wasn't prison time or anything dramatic, but it was on the public record. Anyone who searched her name would find it. That seemed fair to Jack. On a Saturday morning about 6 months after that explosive board meeting, Jack was at his usual spot when Kevin paddled his kayak over. "Hey, did you see the new family moving in on Maple Street?" Kevin called out. "The young couple with the 2 kids? Yeah, I talked to them yesterday." "You know what they said? They chose Riverside Estates specifically because of the pond, said it was the main selling point." Jack smiled at that. "Good, that's how it should be." Kevin paddled off and Jack went back to his fishing. The sun was warm on his face, the water was calm, and somewhere behind him, he could hear kids laughing as they fed the ducks. This was what he'd been fighting for all along, not just his right to fish, but everyone's right to enjoy this little piece of nature in their own backyard. He'd learned something important through all of this. Sometimes standing up for yourself means standing up for everyone, and sometimes the fight is absolutely worth it even when it seems easier to just walk away. Jack felt a tug on his line. He started reeling it in, not sure if it was a fish or just a snag on some weeds. Either way, he was exactly where he wanted to be.